intro, and look at there, we're live. All right. Well, welcome to a special edition of the Cross and the Crescent discussion group. We are here on a Tuesday morning. We're normally here on Sunday afternoons from 4 to 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. But in order to get this guy on, who I've been trying to get on to the program since I think around 1987 or so. Actually, it's this past January we started talking about it. And it is a real treat to have our brother Bob from Speaker's Corner. Now, if you don't know where Speaker's Corner is, or if you have not heard of Bob, I would probably say you've been living under a rock someplace, especially if you're tuning into this show. Bob frequents Speaker's Corner every Sunday afternoon, and he has all kinds of videos from his engagements there. Direct engagements with Muslims and atheists too. I believe you engage atheists and just about anybody that would talk to him. And if you don't know his channel, it's Soko Film. You have two YouTube channels though. You have one person. Am I correct on this, Bob? You have one.
Yeah, I have one personal channel, which is Bob of Speaker's Corner, and that's my channel. And then there's a cameraman that comes down and films me, and I appear on his channel called Soko Films, but we're completely separate, you know.
Okay. Well, enough of me. So let's go with Bob here. Bob, go ahead and tell everybody that does not frequent your channel what you do, who you are, and some of the motivations that you have for doing it.
Yeah, so I work as a full-time evangelist, and I also work as a full-time apologist. And what does that look like on a weekly basis? It looks like corresponding with lots and lots and lots of people, probably around 300, you know, and trying to process that much written correspondence. It means, you know, going out and evangelizing at Speaker's Corner and tackling Islamic arguments, using social media, doing live streams on my own channel, having interviews with scholars and other polemicists on my channel, and, you know, speaking with Muslims, meeting with Muslims away from the corner, cafes, restaurants, and places, and having conversations with them, as well as others, in a hope of drawing them to our Lord. And it works. You know, just last week I was at someone's baptism.
All right.
You know, who became a Christian, who had come to the corner, not last week, but about 2 weeks ago. So,
but they were evangelized at Speaker's Corner, and
we certainly connected at Speaker's Corner, and I definitely contributed towards his conversion, which is the joy that I receive often. I receive news of, you know, people becoming Christians, and it tends to be the demographic that the church wants to reach out to.
Sure.
Younger men. And I also run apologetics classes, polemics classes, discipleship groups, and come and do talks at churches and deliver training sessions for churches and church groups.
Okay, and so you do that on site, or do you do that through like Skype?
Well, both. So I've gone and visited churches to run seminars, but I also host things over Zoom for people that want it or who are maybe too far away. So up and coming, I've got something going off with a whole bunch of Christians from Indonesia.
Well, Indonesia, holy cow!
Yeah.
Wow.
We've done work with Christians in India, Christians in Indonesia. Yeah. So.
I mean, it's such a blessing to be alive today, to be able to see people connect that way, to where you can actually, share the gospel with somebody that's, well, for us, that would be here in America, that'd be halfway around the world. But for you guys, it's still huge distances. And this is, I think we were discussing this on our Sunday show. We were talking about the collapse of Islam, or maybe it was in a discussion someplace else. It doesn't matter. But we were talking about how Muslims now today are having access to all of this information, and I actually hearing an honest critique, an informative critique of their religion, and they're leaving it by the thousands.
And that's true. I've received a number of testimonies myself. I know of at least 2 Muslims who tackled me, both physically, one of them physically, and another one, in a debate, who now have become Christians. One of them is now married to a Christian, and God willing, happily married, in Wales, and another one is in Greece, who I had a debate with, and who is now on the path to becoming a priest in the Greek Orthodox Church. So there are definitely Muslims, even Muslims from the corner, becoming Christians. So,
and do they normally become your best polemicists? Because we've seen a lot of Muslims that have converted out of Islam into Christianity, and we've seen some of them have just become phenomenal. I mean, Adam Seeker, he's just a case in point.
Yeah.
Of somebody who converted out of that, and he has such a thorough knowledge of it, and he's able to discuss it at their level and their understanding, which is, it's just phenomenal blessing. The number of people who've come to Christ through him.
Yeah, I recently had Adam Seeker on my channel. He did a really fantastic presentation.
I saw that.
I was bowled over by it. It was brilliant. Right. But the Christians that I know who've converted from Islam, none of them want to get involved in apologetics and polemics in a big way. I think, for their own personal reasons, and I think safety is a factor for a bunch of them. They don't want to be too public about the fact that they've left Islam, and they tend to be on the shy side or keep it a bit quiet. But that doesn't mean that I don't know them. It doesn't mean that I haven't met them, and it doesn't mean that I haven't, got the video evidence of them arguing with me at the corner and now them being Christian. So I know that they're Christian. I don't care if some Muslim disbelieves me in the chat.
And that's always the charge. It's always lying. He's making it up. He's doing this because he gets paid to lie about Islam, and it's just the same garbage that we hear.
Yeah, all the time.
Yeah,
all the time. But the evangelism is working, and it's definitely a way forward. So.
Well, I see how successful your channel has been, and I appreciate you taking your time out to come to this little old channel, this little corner of the world.
I love your channel, bro. I love your channel. I love your presentations. I think you're an absolutely magnificent presenter. And I think you should have a channel just dedicated to you making presentations, not even discussion, just you making presentations.
And I have ideas, and I appreciate that. And I have ideas that want to do it. And I tell you, one of the things that I have worked on, and the thing is, I just don't have any time. I have 6 grandchildren, and every single night we're going this way and this way. Last night, case in point, I had 2 who had baseball games at the same time. So, and they were at the same park, which is unusual. So I'm going from diamond to diamond, trying. But this is what I've been looking at. This book here, Putting Jesus in His Place.
Oh yeah.
And I've made a bunch of slides on it. It's just that I want to do. I haven't got to the videos yet. So I think maybe this summer during summer break I might be
Well, any past presentation you've made you want to do again, or any future one that you want to prepare and do, please do come and I'd love to have you on my channel to make another presentation. I enjoyed your last one.
Yeah, that was a ball doing that one on Mecca, and I still love talking about that, because I think if you're going to look at it, the argument or a polemic against Islam from a purely historical view, that is the one to go after, is the fact that there's nothing. I mean, it's just like one great big black hole, and I think it's becoming more and more obvious. And this, I don't want to get off topic here, but I mean, I think it's becoming more and more obvious.
Yeah. Well, it's a giant black hole, isn't it? Precisely because of everything that Muslims say about Mecca. It's like, if everything you say about Mecca is true, then we should have some evidence for its existence.
Absolutely, yeah. Because if the city's supposed to be 4,000 years old, there would be some type of archaeological evidence for it. But the fact of the matter is, there isn't any, and there isn't any from cartography. There's nothing on the maps that Mecca was there. There's nothing in the writings of people. So that's why I love covering that topic.
Yeah.
Okay, so for today's topic is we're going to be talking about one of the most popular, and we were discussing this prior to the show, who's the best Islamic apologist out there, and I asked you if it was Hamza, and your answer was what?
Yeah, he's not. He's popular. He's not the best.
Right. Okay. And we want to make sure that we were able to discern the difference. There are several Christian apologists out there that are very popular, but it doesn't mean that they're the best. They're just very popular, and their message and the way that they present things just kind of hits home and resonates with a lot of people. And Hamza is one of them. And we've been talking about looking at some of Hamza's videos. And so I have subjected myself, and I've taken one for the team, and I've gone through several of them. I've endured a lot of what this guy has to say. And so we're going to play a couple clips, and I'm going to allow you to comment on them and give us your thoughts. And I'll share a little bit about what I think is relevant to what he has to say. So let me go ahead and put my screen up over here. And I tell you, and I hate going back and forth. Okay, this is the one, and we're going to play this one I think it's just the first 15 seconds. And here Hamza's making an argument about the Bible, and then we'll let you go ahead and comment on it.
So you're saying to me the Bible is historically accurate?
Almost a new way of writing.
I believe so. I can prove to you right now it's not.
The Arabic language is that as the.
You know what?
I think that's a later one.
Yeah, that's me demonstrating that I'm an amateur at this.
Don't worry.
Here we go. Let's go to the right one, for Pete's sake. Come on. All right. And we're going to get to that one, though, because that one is just incredible dishonesty. Yeah. Okay, present, share screen. He invites. Okay, here we go. All right.
Which Bible do you read? Which is for you is the most reliable? King James,
New
King
James.
Yeah, you're not going to go the NIV.
But I use the ESV a lot because I've got a.
Oh, you can't use the
Greek.
You can't use the KJV and the ESV. There's verses in the KJV, not in the ESV.
Okay, so he's making the argument that telling this guy, this Christian, I think the guy's name's Chris. He's telling him that, and he begins the argument and says, you cannot use one translation and another translation if you were going to be consistent. Is there any truth to that?
No. And the reason why there isn't is because there's a lot of assumptions that Hamza's making that are just not true. His and I'm going to unpack some of those assumptions and reply to them a little. But firstly, let's allow the fact that if you get an ESV and you get a KJV and you read them side by side, you are going to find that there are some verses that are in the KJV that are not in the ESV.
Is your wife your biggest critic?
There we go. It's all right. Don't worry about it.
No, I don't know.
It's the adverts from one of the video screens that you've got open.
Are you
You've got to
kidding?
pause it. It's all right. This happens to me as well.
All right.
I think you've got it.
No, I don't.
What is?
Believe him.
Here we go.
But not all Christians.
There we go. All right. I hit the wrong button.
Don't
Ignore
worry
me.
about it.
Let's go
Yeah.
ahead.
So you've got so it's true what he said as a basic fact that there are verse differences between the KJV and the ESV. Examples include Matthew 17:21, 18:11, Matthew 23:14, Mark 7:16, Mark 9:44, 9:46, Mark 11:26, Luke 17:36, Acts 8:37, Acts 15:34, Romans 16:24. I could give you a list, and I just have.
You did. Right.
But
I can't write that fast, but I
yeah.
tried.
But the thing is that the assumption that he has made is that Christianity is a book-based religion, and that assumption is neither true in Christian practice nor in Christian belief. Every Christian accepts that the church was founded before the Bible was written, that the New Testament was written, and the New Testament was written to a church that already existed, and that's a relevant fact that's going to come into a lot of the arguments as we go forward. When Christians give out the gospel, we don't say to someone, "Well, you can't become a Christian until you've read all the books of the Bible." We don't even say to someone, "You have to read a gospel before you become a Christian." If someone is willing to accept our personal presentation of the gospel and accept our Lord as their Lord and Savior, that's enough. So even in our praxis, in the way that we evangelize, we're not a book-based religion. Now, the thing is, he's talking, and maybe Eric, me and you could do something on this, is what I'd like to set you a challenge. If you go to 17:21 and Matthew 17:21 and read it.
Okay. Matthew 17 and 21. It says, "However, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting."
And fasting, right? So now, if you read that same verse in the ESV,
that's the King James, New King James. So go to the ESV. Okay. ESV means that it was the English Standard Version. Go to Bible Gateway, guys. Bible Gateway is such a treasure trove of different versions. Okay, verse 21. Verse 21. It's not there.
Yeah. So what now is missing from our faith by the absence of that? So my challenge to you, Eric, is while I make the rest of my presentation, is to see, using the ESV alone, if you can establish that prayer and fasting is a way to appeal to God for our prayer needs. So that's my challenge. Use Google, just prayer and fasting, and whether you can establish that we should use prayer and fasting when praying to God about things.
Okay.
I'll continue with my presentation.
Just to go ahead.
Do that, and then you're going to make a mini presentation straight after that, off the cuff, just to show what a weak argument this is. So the reality is that the first falsity is that that Christianity is a book-based religion, which it isn't. The second argument, the second concession that we need to make is that that asking the question, which is the most reliable translation, is a fair one. It's a fair question. I think Hamza's probably saying it unsincerely. So I'd like to reverse it to Hamza, and I'd like to ask him which out of the over 100 Quranic translations in English does he think is reliable, and would he choose to use, and which would he reject? Because I have access to a whole bunch and they don't all say the same, and we'll do a quick experiment on that later as well. There are multiple different translations of the Bible. That's a separate issue from textual variants, and this is a question about textual variants. But I want to defer to what the scholars say about whether any of these textual variants actually harm anything that Christians believe. So I'll quote Dr. Bart Ehrman for you in his book, Misquoting Jesus. He said, "To be sure, of all the hundreds of thousands of textual changes found amongst our manuscripts, most of them are completely insignificant, immaterial, and of no real importance for anything other than showing that scribes could not spell or keep focused any better than the rest of us." And Bart Ehrman has said in that same work that none of the textual variants affect any major Christian doctrine. F.F. Bruce, in his book, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable?, wrote this: "The variant readings about which any doubt remains amongst textual critics of the New Testament affect no material question of historic fact or of Christian faith and practice." Dr. Daniel B. Wallace wrote this in his book, Revisiting the Corruption of the New Testament: "Although there are some significant textual variants, none of them affect any major Christian doctrine. This is a truth that is attested to by both evangelical and critical textual scholars." Craig A. Evans wrote in his book, Fabricating Jesus, None of the variations affect the central teachings of the Christian faith. Rather, they pertain to the peripheral matters, such as the wording of a particular passage, the order of events, or of other details that are not crucial to the message. Dr. Bruce M. Metzger wrote this in his book, The Text of the New Testament. He said, "The essential Christian beliefs concerning Christ, his teaching, and his resurrection are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament." Now, you'll notice that they are making the same distinction that I am, which is that there is a difference between words and message. And the thing is, Christians have their faith in the message of the Bible, and we are 100% confident that that message has been preserved. The study of textual variants only leads us to conclude that the text has basically been stable for 2,000 years. The problem with Christians is not that we've lost words, it's that we've gained a few words in places here and there, and Christians have disagreement about whether those words should be kept and included. And where those differences do occur in the text, as we're going to see, it only affects minor doctrine, which through using other verses in the Bible, you can reestablish anyway.
And that's what I came up with, by the way.
What, sorry?
I got 35 helpful Bible verses for fasting. So find
fasting and prayer. Yeah. So show me fasting. So show me now. You've literally done it in real time whilst I've been talking. So now you make a very brief presentation showing the general principle that Christians can and should use prayer and fasting to appeal to God.
Well, I'm just what I'm doing is I'm just even if this verse does not, even if this verse was omitted from late or earlier manuscripts, we can still find other verses within the New Testament itself that are not in doubt that tell us to pray and fast.
Exactly.
You go to, let's see here, Matthew 6:16 through 18. It says, "When this is Christ, when you fast, not if you fast, but when you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces and show others they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they have received their full reward." So here Jesus is telling his disciples to fast. Then you go to Matthew 9. Then the disciples came to him saying, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said, "Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them?" So here you have another allusion to fasting. The Old Testament is full of it. Psalms 35:13-14, Daniel 9:2-5, Ezra 8:23. Then in Mark, it says, "When Jesus saw the crowd running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, you mute and deaf spirit." Oh, here it is. Okay, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And after crying out, convulsing terribly. Okay, why could we not, the disciples asked, why could we not cast it out? And he said to them, this kind, oh, this is the one that we had read.
Yeah,
though,
this is the one that we're talking about.
All right. So
Yeah.
that's, all right. But there are others. John 2:12, even now declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting, with weeping, and with mourning. So again, fasting. It's all
It's
over.
fasting and prayer. So the point is, it's not very hard to establish fasting and prayer as a principle. And in terms of, you look at the pattern of biblical prayer and fasting comes in times of extreme unction. So an extreme petition. So for example, when Ruth was to go before the king, what did she ask the people to do? To pray and to fast for 3 days, that she might have the strength for what she was going to do.
Was that Esther or Ruth?
Esther.
Esther.
Was it? No. Yes. Esther. Esther. Sorry. Yes, you're right. Esther. But the story's right. Just
right.
There's a perfect example of a textual variant done in real time. Like, we have two accounts. We have two accounts of the story. One in which I gave Ruth, and one in which the brother gives Esther. Yeah. But the reality is, the story is the same, regardless of which name is in there. And actually, the sources support Esther, not Ruth. So my version is clearly the textual variant that can be dismissed. And that's how textual variants work. You just seen an example in real time, thanks be to God. So my point is that Christ is applying, whether those words are in the text or not in the text, Christians can pray and fast to cast out demons. And in extreme unction, fasting with prayer is normative for Christian behavior. And I would say that casting out a demon probably requires extreme unction. So even if Christ didn't say pray and fast, Christians can still pray and fast and should still pray and fast. So nothing has changed about our practice. Nothing has changed about our beliefs. What I would say is that as Christians, we do need to make sure that we are using translations that are faithful to the Greek as much as possible. We do need to be aware that there are such things as textual variants, and we should recognize and frame that properly, that textual variants are a serious question for Christians, but they're not a knockdown question for Christians. They're not the kind of question that fundamentally makes our faith implode, because the faith isn't built on the Bible. The Bible is built on the faith of the apostles. Sure. And the Bible emerges.
Opposite of what Islam is.
Exactly, and that's the fallacy that Hamza's making. He's thinking that what's true for the Quran must be true for Islam. But just pick any verse at random, bro, in the Quran. Tell me to go to any verse you want to in the Quran.
4:157.
4:157. Okay, let's have a look at that. Because I'm just going to show you that Quranic translations also differ as well. And it is a question of translation. And then I'm going to come on to textual variants in the Quran as well, just to show that they've got exactly the same issues that we've got. So in Surah 157, Ahmed Ali translates it as this: "And for saying we killed the Christ, Jesus, son of Mary, who was the apostle of God, but they neither killed him nor crucified him, though it so appeared to them. Those who disagree in the matter are only lost in doubt. They have no knowledge about it other than conjecture, for surely they did not kill him." Ahmed Khan: "And because they said we have killed the Messiah, Isa, the son of Maryam, the messenger of Allah, they did not slay him, nor did they crucify him, but a lookalike was created for them, and those who disagree concerning it are in doubt about it. They have nothing of it except the following of assumptions, and without doubt they did not kill him." Madudi translates it: "And their sayings, we slew the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, the messenger of Allah, whereas in fact they had neither slain him nor crucified him, but the matter was made dubious to them, and those who differed about it too were in a state of doubt. They have no definite knowledge of it, but merely follow conjecture, and they surely slew him not." Talal Itani translates it: and for their saying, we have killed the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary, the messenger of God. In fact, they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it appeared to them as if they did. Indeed, those who differ about him are in doubt about it. They have no knowledge of it, except the following of assumptions. Certainly they did not kill him. Now, a quick, fast reading, that all kind of sounds like it's saying the same thing, and it essentially is. But some of those translations kind of imply that Allah is the one. Some of them more clearly imply that Allah is the one behind the deception than other translations. I don't know if you picked it up.
Yeah. The main thing that I was, and the reason why I had you go to that is because in some translations, it says that his likeness was cast upon somebody else. They killed somebody else, and then the other translations, it only appeared to them that he was crucified. So you have completely different meanings being.
Yeah. So an example of that. Go on, finish your point, because I'll read you an example of it.
Yeah, you have a completely different meaning. Here you have, well, it only looked like Jesus died here, but then over here in other translations, you have people saying, well, his likeness was put on somebody else, so therefore this is why it appeared. So you have the imposition of more meaning, and they get this. We know this. It comes from the second great treaty of Seth, Hammadi, or what is it, Nag Hammadi, Gnostic gospel from the third century. We know where it comes from.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is where the same verse, but completely different meanings. Go ahead.
Yeah. So in Karibulla's translation, it reads exactly you've said. And for their saying, we killed the Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary, the messenger of Allah. They did not kill him, nor did they crucify him. But to them, he, the crucified one, had been given the look of the prophet Jesus. Those who differ concerning the prophet Jesus are surely in doubt regarding him. They have no knowledge of him except the following of supposition, and it is certainly they did not kill him. So as you can see, different Quranic translations translate the verse differently with slightly nuanced implications depending on which way you throw it. But it gets worse. So this is a book I want to recommend to people, Corrections of Early Quranic Manuscripts, because there are textual variants in the early Quran as well. So I'm not opening to a totally random page. I put a marker in, but I did actually flick through this to just land at a random page when I was prepping. So I'm just going to read from page 47 of Dr. Daniel Brubaker's book, using example 5, a Quranic page, possibly 8th or 9th century, that's 2nd century after Hijrah or 3rd century after Hijrah, which contains several post-production corrections. And he goes on to list them, and I'm going to just read some examples for you. This folio begins in the middle of Surah 691. Even as it now stands, it has a variant rasm, for example. And I'm going to slaughter the Arabic, so if anyone is an Arabic speaker, I apologize. I'm not trying to insult the language or the culture. I have a lot of respect for Arabs, but you'll obviously, you can correct me. I've got a Muslim friend who just says, stop speaking Arabic. he just says, stop speaking Arabic. So Wa'la, or Nur, of Quran 691 is written instead of Wo in this portfolio, and the Lam Alif has been omitted. The meaning here is thus you and your fathers, rather than the 1924 Cairo edition, which says you nor your fathers. So clearly that's a textual variant with a meaningful difference. Another example is what reads Mubarakun Musadiku. It is blessed and confirms in the 1924 Cairo edition, as found in Surah 692, is written in this manuscript without the long medial alif in the first word, and also with a long alif in the end of both words to render Mubarakan, Musadikan, apparently a blessed and confirming one. So not it is blessed and confirms, but a blessed and confirming one. The war, which is and in Arabic, that precedes the litundir, that you may warn in the 1924 Cairo edition, is absent on this page. Shall I go on? I have, yeah.
You made the point and demonstrated that this idea of perfect preservation, is
so that there are textual variants in the earliest codices of the Quran. The thing is that everyone's got to remember the Quran is smaller than the New Testament, and it's far later than the New Testament.
Right.
And the fact that we've got a smaller book much later, 7th century, that has textual variants in it that we can find evidence for, means that Muslims don't have an argument when we're talking about a text that's 2,000 years old. So it's 700 years earlier, and it's written, and it's a much bigger collection of books. Sorry, I might have. Yeah, go on.
The point that I don't try to take the side of the Muslims on this, but just to illustrate their point and drive their point home, if you go through those variants that Brubaker and other scholars are now finding within the Quran and the original manuscripts themselves, they really don't have an impact on any of the core teachings of Islam itself.
Yeah,
yes, there are variants, but that doesn't impact the core teachings, the meaning of the overarching meaning of the text, or what their beliefs are.
I would agree.
Same thing applies to the variants that the several thousands of variants that we find in our manuscripts. There's no impact on any core teaching of the church, and we just accept that because this is, it isn't like we have, cut and paste, back in the 7th century or in the 1st century. They actually had to hand jam that stuff, and people are fallible and they make errors, and we recognize it, and we're able to address that through textual criticism. The difference is that they don't allow that, though, because it runs contrary to the Sharia. You cannot second guess, and anything that, by consensus, is considered blasphemy, is considered apostasy.
Well, the thing, yeah, exactly. You've hit your nail on the head. Is that a textual variant in the Bible is a serious but non-threatening condition for the Christian, but a textual variant in the Quran is a fundamentally contradictory counter evidence to the truth claims of the Quran itself, because the Quran claims that Allah is the protector of the book, and that he would protect the book, as according to the Muslim tasfirs, that he would protect the book from corruption. So the fact that we have found textual variants demonstrates that Allah has failed in his promises, which means that there's a contradiction in the Quran, which means that it's not from Allah.
So that means that Hamza's a hypocrite then?
Hamza is working to a double standard, definitely. But his double standard is allowed to go on because lots of Christians fall into the trap of his assumption, which is that Christianity is a Bible-based religion. On a slightly tangent point, but I think a very true point, an important point, I do think the time has come for Christians to know who's translating the Bible. Because, and it's not a relevant point to this video, but it is a point relevant to the point that we're talking about, is that now we've got to the point where there are scholars translating the Bible that aren't Christians, and they're coming to the translations with their own agendas.
I see what you're saying, sure. Yeah.
And we need to raise this concern amongst our brethren that it's time for now to list any translator who works on a biblical translation.
And, and I think if you're some of these versions of these people who publish these versions, I think that should be we sign not an agreement, but a confessional. You have to confess that you believe in the sacredness of the scripture, the truthfulness and therein. And I agree 100%, because you can get anybody come in there like this guy, like the guy that you just quoted for him, misquoting Jesus, Bart Ehrman.
Yeah.
You can get him to come in there and, completely. And then everybody, and I like your allusions to Daniel Wallace. And I would encourage anybody, if you can, go over to his website, watch his lectures on textual criticism. And the guy is frighteningly candid about the number of textual variants that we do, but he's able to articulate the explanation for it in such a manner that even the layman can understand. And here's the bottom line. The reason why we have so many textual variants from the New Testament is because we have so many manuscripts. If we didn't have the million, 2.5 million pages of Greek New Testament manuscripts is what we have. If we didn't have that much, then we wouldn't have the number of variants that we have. But the fact of the matter is, since we have so much abundance of riches, or what does he call it?
An embarrassing abundance of riches.
Right. Yeah.
Because it's 5,000 Greek texts, 10,000 Latin texts, and 5,000 texts in other languages, which means that when we compare all these texts, not only do we have an uncountable number of textual variants, but it's really easy to spot the fact that most of them are just spelling mistakes. It's like, what's the difference between, how do you spell John? John, Jonn, John, how would you translate that? You just translate it as John. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that's 99% of all the textual variants that we talk about in this uncountable number. That's all of them, 99% right there. The 1% that has meaning, well, we can spot those really easily, like the Comic Hanon, the Adultere Pericope, the longer ending of the variant endings of Mark, including the longer ending of Mark. They stand out like a sore thumb to us. But yet absolutely none of them affect any essential anything essential of the Christian message. And any minor effect that they have, it's more like a shade of pink or a shade of red. It's a little brighter or darker. It doesn't actually even change the minor doctrines. It just changes a nuance in the minor doctrine.
And a lot of those variants, as we pointed out earlier, are as far as fasting and prayer. You did a great job of illustrating that. Are found elsewhere in Scripture. Or, for an example, Jesus forgiving sins. We have it in Mark. I mean, we have it in different parts of the Gospels where we can come back and say, well, look, just because you might not believe this here, I mean, there's a variant here, we'd have it over here also. So we have a multiplicity of different descriptions of the same events that enable us to articulate those core Christian beliefs.
Yeah. Before we move on, I just want to lay down a challenge to any Muslim out there who thinks that my thesis is wrong. Well, show me a textual variant that changes an essential doctrine that I believe in. And if you do, I'll stop doing apologetics and polemics and I'll get off YouTube. There you go. Surely Muslims, that's worth a try.
Okay, well, I'm sure. I hope they send you those emails instead of me, because I don't want my inbox getting all clogged up. But yeah, that's and this is where what Hamza's doing. What I think what Hamza's doing is so completely dishonest. Is he's trying to prey on the ignorance, and this is what he does. He preys on the ignorance of Christians at Speaker's Corner. And when you have somebody like yourself or other Christian apologists go out there and confront him, he gets shut down rather quick. And I've noticed that a lot of his videos are just with common people that go out there and speak. And one of them that we're going to talk to was Jewish. Okay.
Okay.
You want to go on the next one? My goodness.
Yeah, I mean,
on the first clip.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm good to keep going for a while. So let's press on.
Let me go to this one. Well, we'll just stay on this one here for a second. He says he has two claims here. Let me bring this back up. Oh, I took it off. Why'd you do that? Okay, this is, he invites Muslims, share, and we are at the 2-minute 44-second mark. Let me make this full screen. Here we go.
I've got two claims. All right. I don't believe you can justify Jesus being God, even if every word of the New Testament is true. I don't believe you can. Yeah? That's my first claim. My second claim is, obviously, I don't believe they're reliable anyway. But even if they were, I don't believe you could justify it. Now.
Okay, so what he's saying here is that he's making two statements here. He's saying you cannot demonstrate that Jesus is God, even if he accepts the entirety of the New Testament, or the first one is that he'll accept how did he say that? He was going to accept the entirety of the New
Yeah,
Testament.
even if every word was true, you couldn't justify it.
Yeah, you can't justify that Jesus is God.
Right.
True.
So so to answer Hamza and Muslims directly, one assumes that the claims of the Quran are normative, and so therefore let us look. If we assume, for the sake of Hamza's test, that every part of the New Testament is true, therefore we don't need to question its reliability or its truth claims. I mean, that is a slightly self-defeating argument, but let's pretend for a moment we now have to justify it. Well, let's justify it with the Quran, which is normative. So the Quran gives certain titles to Muhammad, to Allah, the sock puppet of Muhammad, but he gives certain titles to Muhammad. So for instance, it calls Allah the light of the heavens and the earth in Surah 24 verse 35. But funnily enough, Jesus is also called the light of the world in John chapter 8 verse 12 and in John chapter 9 verse 5. The Quran describes Allah as the truth in Surah 22 verse 6, but Jesus, our Lord, proclaims himself to be the truth in John 14:6, where he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Allah is declared the judge. Allah is described as the judge in Surah 11, verse 45. But Jesus is described as the judge of the living and the dead in Acts 10:42 and 2 Timothy 4:1. And Christ himself says that the Father judges no one, he has given all judgment to me. You see that both in the Quran, you've got Allah creating in the Quran. He's the creator, but in the Christian scriptures, Jesus is the creator. The Quran is declaring Allah as uncreated, and in the scriptures we hear that Jesus is uncreated. Now, for whatever reason, the notes that I had to show that I cannot find. So just bear with us 1 second while I just find where my notes. Bear with us.
Okay. Did you? I don't know what happened, but my system just crashed. And let me see here. Let me remove this.
Can I? Sorry, I just want to. Sorry, did you want to say something, Eric? Because I've got more examples to give.
No, I just said my system just crashed, and I just had to bring everything back up. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, that's fine.
I missed almost everything. Well, the last part that I saw that you were talking about, Jesus is the light of the world, the truth, the judge. Yeah. Okay.
That's fine. I've not really got further than that because I'm struggling to find my notes, but bear with us. So another example is that the fact that in the Quran, one of the titles of Allah is Al-Qahar, the subduer, but Christ says that all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me in Matthew 28:18. So who's the subduer? Is it Allah or is it Jesus? In one of the titles of Allah is Al-Malik, the king, but in the Gospel of John, Christ says in 18:37, I am king. You are right in saying that I am king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world to testify to the truth. So who's king? Is it Allah or is it Jesus? In the Quran, it says that Allah is Al-Mumin, which means the faithful. But in John 14:1, Jesus says, do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me, which is showing that that Jesus can be trusted, that he is faithful in what he does. Let me go back and get you some more examples. Bear with me.
Well, the most common one that I'd see as you're looking for that is the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last.
That was my next one, yeah.
Was it? Okay. Go ahead.
No. Yeah. So go on, bro. You've got it right.
Well, then we find
finish it.
God in the Old Testament being referred to as the Alpha Omega, and then Jesus also in the book of Revelation, I think in 3 different spots, he's referring to himself as the Alpha Omega, and also in the Quran we find Allah being referenced as the Alpha Omega. So if you're sharing all these same names and you're going to make this argument that, well, you just can't say that Jesus is God, justifying it using the New Testament, well, then you're ignoring a lot of the meaning of what Scripture says about him. And I think that's what you're doing with these points that you're making. But also, as I mentioned earlier, with this book here, putting Jesus in his place, the authors of this book do a huge favor for Christians when arguing this or making this argument. You know, how can you show that Jesus says that he is, or how does the New Testament describe Jesus as being God? Where can I find that? Well, it's all over the place. You have hundreds of different verses within that text itself that provide that. That's why I want to do those videos if I ever get to them.
Yeah, and also Muslims will immediately recognize that Allah is the creator, but it says in Scripture, speaking of Jesus, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created. Mm-hmm. In the Gospel of John, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were made by him, and nothing in the whole of creation was made without him. So, you know, like Allah and Jesus are not just having the same titles, they're doing the same actions, they're performing the same actions, and according to the Scriptures, both are uncreated. Allah is uncreated and Jesus is uncreated. So if we're, as Hamza saying, if we're saying that we if every word of the Bible is true, then it's justified based upon the Quranic testimony to say that Jesus is God in the Bible.
Yeah, this is where he's trying this. And this, if you continue to watch it, we're not going to, but if you continue to watch the video, he tries to muddy all of the objections that the guy that he's encountering has, and again, being dishonest in his representation of those verses, and that's what they have to do in order to try to score those points, or in order to make those points.
Definitely.
Okay. Do you want to make any more points on that? Or do you want to go into the next one?
But yeah, just another one, just one final example to leave in terms of the actions being the same. You've got the fact that in the Quran, Allah is described as the one who gives life and can raise the dead in Surah 22, verse 6. But in John 11, Christ is seen as raising the dead, and also in the Gospel of John, I think it's the Gospel of John, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. So there you go. One more. I do apologize. Judgment. Muslims will immediately recognize that in the Quran, Allah is the judge in Surah 11, verse 45. Or have I mentioned this one? I think I have.
Yeah.
Yes, I have mentioned it. Sorry, I'm repeating myself. Okay, we're done on that one. Unless you've got more to add.
This next one, let me get it up here and hope I don't butcher it like I did last time. 443. He is making the
No, I've lost you. So I suspect my brother has lost his connection. So can people just tell me in the chat whether you can still hear me, or have I been lost as well? Are we still there, guys? Yes. Are we all frozen, or is it just Eric that's frozen, guys? Okay, so you can all hear me. So whilst Eric gets back into the chat, I believe the next one he's going to do, and this is why it's always good to plan these things in advance, is to argue that Paul is the one who's the author of the Bible that Paul is the one who created the biblical story, that he's the one behind the gospel narrative. And so to try and demonstrate to Hamza and his acolytes that this is wrong, we just need to start thinking logically. And the first thing that we have to ask ourselves is that there are certain facts that are on the ground in the first century that were well attested against that were attested long before the 7th century. So these would include things like the tomb of Christ being empty, post-mortem experiences of Christ, that the Sunday was venerated as a special and holy day, and that the cross was taken as a sacred symbol. Now, the thing is, if there was no resurrection, then none of these facts would be true, but they are well attested, as well as the fact that Christ was crucified. It is a well attested fact. Now, if the Quranic narrative is true, even with their idea that it was something where someone else was crucified in his place, that would not account for everything that occurred in the first century. It wouldn't account for venerating a Sunday as a special day. It wouldn't account for the multiple post-mortem experiences, which, by the way, even scholars like Dr. Bart Ehrman accept are real. It doesn't account for the cross becoming a sacred symbol, because the Jews had a paradigmatic formula for what to do if your teacher died. And the paradigmatic formula is, if your teacher died, then you venerate the tomb. Not that you start observing the first day of the week as something special and claiming that someone had risen bodily from the dead. But this all occurred in the first century, long before Islam. So it wasn't like they invented this to disprove Islam. This just was. The question is, why was it? And if Paul made it up, if Paul made up these things, well, that means there would still be a body in a tomb. That would mean that there is no reason to honor the Sunday as a special day. Why would you? Like, the idea that Paul made this up is just unrealistic. You're welcome back, Eric. I've had this experience myself, so I knew exactly what to do, and I've just continued with the presentation. So I don't know if you were listening.
For carrying my show on for me.
Yep. There you go, bro.
This is incredible. This is I've been doing this, and my system has never crashed on me in the middle of the show like this. This is nuts, and I apologize.
Don't worry about it. I've been there myself. I was doing an interview. Don't worry, Eric. Honestly, I was doing an interview with a Somali Christian woman who had converted from Islam to become Christian, and I got kicked out of my own show because someone turned my internet off. And one of my flatmates turned my internet off, and so she was just left there all on her own. So don't worry. So I just carried on. Anyway, you to bring you back in, if you could look up where Paul talks about his sufferings and all of his deprivations that he suffered for the preaching of the gospel, if you could pull that up, because that will be a relevant point. Now, the thing is, if someone was going to make up their religion, guys, what would we expect to see? We would expect to see them benefiting from making things up. We would expect just-on-time revelation. We would expect them to have special exemptions to the rules that they give to other people, like the guy in Africa, the fake Christian preacher who told his followers to starve themselves to death if they wanted to see Jesus. But funnily enough, he didn't starve himself to death to see Jesus, but he did ask for money. So people that make up religions like Joseph Smith or L. Ron Hubbard benefit from the fact that they are making up their religion. And do we see evidence of that in Muhammad? And do we see evidence of that in Paul? Have you found the passage where Paul talks about his sufferings? Don't worry if you aren't. I'll go on to Muhammad.
Okay.
Let me give some examples then of Muhammad's.
I have all kinds of examples. I know which one you're talking about.
The one where he gives the long list.
Days and
3 nights. I think I might be able to find it myself. I'll race you. Come on then. I'll do it analog. You do it with internet, and we'll see who gets there first.
Give no offense. Yes, I just brought up a general list. I thought you wanted me to bring up a general list, and the reason why is because, well,
no, he actually gives a whole narrative of why, he basically he argues this is why I'm.
Acts 27.
Not in Acts. It's in one of his letters.
2 Corinthians. Here it is. 2 Corinthians 11:25.
Go on.
Okay. Thrice I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day adrift in the deep.
That's one of them. Now there's a much longer list that he gives.
Yeah. Let's see. This is 11. I believe it's good night. King James. 2 Corinthians 11. 2 Corinthians 11. Come on. 11. And
here we go. No, sorry, I haven't found it.
Apologies.
What, sorry?
Okay, 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one.
Where is that?
Rod. This is 2 Corinthians 11, beginning in verse 23, 24. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A day and a night I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger from the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure, and apart from other things, there is this daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches.
Right. So this doesn't sound like a man who's having necessarily the best time in being an apostle. And Paul, rather than having timely revelation that just seems to get him out of trouble every time, on the contrary, he ends up wrestling with the churches and sometimes struggling with the churches to disciple them. And you can see, as read by Eric, in what verse was that again? What passage?
2 Corinthians 11, 21 or 23 through 28.
Right. The many deprivations that Paul had, but compare this to some of the timely revelations that Muhammad had. So, for example, bear with us. I'll read from Sahih al-Bukhari, book 66, hadith 12, or some number systems give it 4990, and some give the reference as volume 6, book 61, hadith 512. There was revealed, not equal are those believers who sit at home and those who strive and fight in the cause of Allah. Now, it's a reference to Surah 495, but you won't find it like that in your Quran. What you will find in your Quran is this. The Prophet said, "Call Zayd for me and let him bring the board, the ink pot, and the scapular bone, or the scapular bone and the ink pot." And then he said, "Right, not equal are those believers who sit." And at that time, Amir bin Maktum, the blind man, was sitting behind the Prophet. He said, "O Allah's apostle, what is your order for me as regards the above verse, as I am a blind man?" So instead of the above verse, the one I've just quoted, the following verse was revealed, which is the one you'll now find in your Quran. Not equal are those believers who sit at home, except those who are disabled by except those who are disabled and those who strive and fight in the cause of Allah.
Mhm.
So literally, Allah's given this revelation to Muhammad. He's uttered it. You've got a record of it. So the Quran exists in one form at one moment. But because the verse basically has no account for a blind man, and the blind man asks him publicly, "But what about me? I'm blind," which is a bit embarrassing, isn't it? Like, you've just given this verse, and now you've just got caught out by this circumstance, and then boom, a new revelation suddenly appears in which actually there's an account for people, an allowance made for people that are disabled. And so the Quran changes form from one minute to the next based on an embarrassing incident. That is what you expect when a person makes up their religion. Let me give you another example. So, for example,
Let me ask you, Bob, did that video clip play when I got cut off?
No, it didn't. So do you want to play the video clip to give context to what I'm saying?
He says that Paul, his assertion here is that Paul's letters influenced the Gospels.
Yes.
So
that is the argument. So he's essentially making up. Yeah, he's essentially trying to suggest that Paul made Christianity up.
Right. Yeah, and this is a common, and we both know this is a very common Islamic
trope
polemic. Yeah.
Letters of Paul and such. So let's test that reliability. Yeah. Now, I would even cut to the chase, and I wouldn't even bother with the Gospels initially. My first port of call is Paul.
You don't trust Paul?
No. And I believe Paul letters influence the Gospels.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm just going to give one more. I've got a lot to say on this. I hope you don't mind, Eric.
No, go on ahead. I'm loving it.
So I want to give another example. So I'm sure you've heard of the Battle of the Trench. This comical experience, this comical story of this battle outside Medina, where they dug a trench, and then the army that arrived suddenly went, "Well, now that they've dug this trench, we can't possibly go around it. There's nothing we can do. We're completely
like a Monty Python."
It's like a Monty Python sketch. It really is. But anyway, prior to this battle, because somehow Muhammad knew that the army was coming, I don't know how, maybe he had spies who were informed or something. He commanded his followers to build a trench outside of Medina in anticipation of the upcoming battle. And a lot of his followers just walked off and didn't. They didn't put in a day's work, as it were. They walked away after when they got tired or when they were fed up. There's an example of one person coming to him and asking him for permission to leave, and Muhammad grants it. And as soon as he could, that particular Sahaba returned. But then, in this context, what should happen? Allah the sock puppet arrives and says in Quran 24:62, only those are believers who believe in God and his messenger. When they are with him on a matter requiring collective action, they do not depart until they have asked for his leave. Those who ask for thy leave are those who believe in God and his messenger. So when they ask for thy leave for some business of theirs, give leave to those of them whom thou will, and ask God for their forgiveness, for God is oft forgiving, most merciful. Now, the translation, those who are true believers in Allah ask Muhammad's permission to leave, and those who do not believe in Allah are among the disbelievers, do not ask permission. To further emphasize the point, like in Ibn Ishaq's record, the following words are found. Do not treat the call of the apostle among you as if it were one of you calling upon another. God knows those of you who steal away to hide themselves. Let those who conspire to disobey his order beware lest trouble or a painful punishment befall them. It's kind of helpful, isn't it? Like, you needed something to emphasize the idea of doing your duty and not just wandering off, but getting permission. And then, lo and behold, Allah provides a verse that says exactly that.
Mhm.
It's pretty cool. If only we all had a sock puppet that could help us in times of great distress.
A
And then, of
divine
course,
sock puppet, a
yeah,
divine
divine
sock
sock
puppet
puppet.
that nobody can prove otherwise.
Yeah.
How convenient, right?
Most embarrassing of all is obviously Muhammad's marriage to Zainab bint Jash,
Mhm.
who was the wife of the adopted son of Muhammad, who Muhammad encountered and became erotically infatuated with. But obviously, you can't marry your wife's son, because you've adopted them and they're your son, and you can't marry their wife. But lo and behold, a verse from Allah comes down in Quran 33:37, which states, "And remember when you said to him, Zayd bin Haritha,
Sorry.
freed." Sorry?
I had this plan over here. My fault.
On whom God has bestowed grace, and you have done favor, keeping your wife to yourself and fear God. But you did hide in yourself. I'm trying to skip all the brackets. That which God will make manifest. You did fear the people, whereas God had a better right than you should fear him. So when Zaid had accomplished his desire from her, we gave her to you in marriage, so that there may be no difficulty to the believers in respect of the wives of their adopted sons. And by this passage, adoption is abrogated, is how Muslims treat that. But it's appropriate, it's like, this is what we would expect to see if a man was inventing his religion. Just in time kind of revelations. We find it with Joseph Smith and the Mormon Church.
Mhm.
Polygamy was the foundational doctrine of their religion. The United States, under Christian pressure, put loads of pressure on them. And then, boom, a prophet arrives and says, oh, polygamy is no longer a thing that we need to practice. Mormonism said that, that black people were accursed. And then, surprise, surprise, that gets abolished. So a religion that changes to suit the times and the needs of the group or the individual is exactly what we need, what we expect when a religion's been invented. L. Ron Hubbard, a man who wrote in a letter, the quickest way to get rich is to invent a religion, and he invents the only religion where you have to pay a fortune to get secret revelation. I mean, come on, guys. It's kind of like, it's obvious. So he's accusing Paul of making up Christianity. He's got no evidence to support that. And actually, it's the other way around.
Yeah, I was going to just make a couple comments on that Zayed and Zainab thing. Just to satisfy his lusts, he gets this revelation. I mean, you can't get any more obvious of what's going on here than this verse here. And one of the worst things about it is, one of the most beautiful things that human beings do is adopt the children of other human beings and give them their name, give them inheritance, give them a life. And because this man was so pathetically sexualized, over-sexualized, or however you want to describe it, and followed his lust everywhere, he destroys one of the most precious things that human beings do. And it's absolutely disgusting to think of that something as beautiful as adoption can be destroyed by a man because of his lust, and that you have almost 2 billion people today following that. Another couple examples that I had listed here about Paul inventing Christianity. I mean, we have passages within the New Testament itself that demonstrate that this is not true. If you go to 2 Peter 3:15 and 16, where it talks about where Peter is talking about Paul, and it says, "And as also our beloved brother Paul, according to his wisdom given him, has written to you." So Peter is treating Paul's letters as authoritative. So to say that Peter or Paul somehow influenced Peter to provide the Gospel of Mark is just absolutely absurd. You go to Galatians, Paul says in Galatians, where he got the gospel message from, in chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. And it says, when in verse 9, it says, when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles. Go to the Gentiles doing what? Preaching the gospel message that the Peter and John, or James, Peter, John, and James, the brother of Christ, had given to Paul. So how can Paul influence them when they gave Paul the gospel message? And the best one that I absolutely love is when we find in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 3 through 8. You have scholars today are dating this passage, this creedal passage, as being written and being used in the early church within 6 months of the crucifixion. And we know Paul's conversion did not happen for 2 to 3 years after the crucifixion. So how can you have this early church creed where it discussed that, where we saw Jesus, Jesus was crucified on the cross, was rose again according to the scriptures, and then he was seen by John, or Peter, John, the 12, and 500. How can you have this creedal statement that clearly outlines the gospel message, developed before Paul was even converted to Christianity? This is where we look at people like Hamza, and this is why I say he's a target-rich environment to attack the hypocrisy and the deceit of the plumbuses that you have to deal with out there on a weekly basis at Speaker's Corner. The average Christian is not equipped to do this, though.
Yeah, and I think that exerts the need for us to take apologetics seriously and to convince our fellowships that they need to take apologetics seriously. The fundamental problem with the whole idea that Paul invented Christianity is it ignores the fact of the Jerusalem tradition. So Paul is clearly tapping into an earlier tradition from him, and 1 Corinthians 15 is an example of that. And this is a well-established principle in academics. Dr. Seyoon Kim, Dr. Mike Lacona, Dr. James D.G. Dunn, in his New Perspectives on Paul, for instance, argues that Paul's gospel is not simply a reflection of the Jerusalem tradition, but represents a significant development and innovation within early Christianity. But the point is, James Dunn is recognizing that there is a Jerusalem tradition that Paul is tapping into. It's how N.T. Wright described Paul as being, so Christ came and was the sort of the surprising answer to Old Testament prophecies that resolved the Old Testament prophecies. And then Paul was the first one to go, not the first one, but one of the most significant people to go, well, what now? What do we do now?
Sure.
The difference between the one who writes the music and the one who composes the music, the one who interprets the composition of the music. So this idea of a Jerusalem tradition is something well established in academic fields. It's clearly evidenced, and Dr. Seyoon Kim really goes to town on this. He really does a deep study on it, and he identifies multiple places: 1 Corinthians 15, 1-5, Galatians 1, 18-19, Galatians 2, 1-10, Romans 1, 16-17. Of all as being all passages where clearly Paul is dipping into a Jerusalem tradition that predates his own conversion.
Sure.
And as he's tapping into that tradition, what is that tradition? It is that Christ was crucified, Christ was resurrected, Christ will come again. It's the basic kerygma that Christians have recited in their liturgical worship for 2,000 years in chant. It's the earliest proclamation of the church. You find it in the early sermons in the book of Acts. And it predates Paul. So Paul can't be the inventor of something that he converted to. And let's remember that, because it is a majorly important point. Paul, an enemy of the church, a persecutor of the church, converted to a religion that he was persecuting. If you convert to a religion you're persecuting, then you're not the inventor of that religion.
Okay, I got a rebuttal for that.
Go on.
Okay, and this is an honest to God rebuttal that I've heard from a polemicist saying, well, if you're Paul, and you really want to put the death nail in this religion, and take away its effectiveness, why not pretend that you've converted and then try to influence them to preach a different message? And that's and the argument is that's exactly what Paul did. Because of Paul's deviousness, he decided to become like them, but to alter the message oh so subtly, so it would not conform to Quran 4:157, which we discussed earlier. It's just bizarre.
It's got the horse before the cart. It's got the carriage before the horse, sorry, because it assumes that Paul was writing to disprove a religion that came centuries later, which is fallacious logic at its finest. Now, they're obviously claiming that there was some kind of Muslim following of Jesus based upon Quranic testimony that was written in the 7th century. But that same Quranic testimony states that Allah will make the followers of the Muslim Isa superior to those that disbelieve until the day of resurrection. That's what the Quran claims. So by the Quranic testimony, if that counter argument is true against Paul, then we have to conclude that Allah failed in his promises because Pauline Christianity won.
Right.
It didn't just win, it won big. And actually, if you read the Quran carefully, it makes no distinction between Romans and Christians. It sees them as being synonymous, because obviously at the time of Muhammad, they were synonymous. But the reality is then that the Roman Christianity is the apostolic Christianity that we believe in. And that shows that the Muslim followers of Jesus did not and were not victorious and superior in the uppermost over their enemies, like the Quran promises that they would be. The other problem with that is it makes Allah a liar. Because go on.
Well, I'm just going to say this is exactly what you were alluding to, and this is what you would find. This is a man who's, he's obviously historically unaware of the chronology in which all these events occurred, writing the Quran. And then you have apologists like Hamza here trying to defend that by trying to go after Paul. Because this is the David Wood argument. He goes, you think of all the apostles, you cannot impugn the integrity of the apostles. But so who do they go after? Well, they go after the one man that did not follow Christ for the 3 years. So you have to impugn his integrity somehow. But in order to do that, you have to completely ignore the chronology that we find in the book of Acts. Acts is basically Luke. 2 is all it is. It's written by the same guy from the same perspective. And he does provide the chronology that Paul converted much later after the church was born. So you have to ignore all of that in order to get at the position that he wants you to be at, in order to try to marginalize the epistles of Paul and the impact that Paul had on the church.
And also Muslims, have got to establish motive. Well, why would Paul want to change a religion so that it doesn't observe the law when Paul himself cared so much about tradition? And that's part of Dr. Mike Lacona's thesis in his book. I want to encourage you guys to read it. It's another good book for you. Like in his and look at the size of it, don't it's a proper academic book. And in his thesis, he goes on to point out that Paul really cares about tradition, in that he cares so much about tradition that he uses and appeals to the church to follow tradition. And if people don't follow the traditions, the Jerusalem tradition, the tradition of the church, that they you shouldn't even mingle with them. Because remember, the Gospels had not been written by the time that Paul was writing his letters, and Paul had not yet written all of his letters.
True.
So, there wasn't a New Testament to use as a referent. There were some letters at the time of Paul's life, and maybe some of the first Gospels were either being written or soon to be written thereafter. So the whole point is that people who claim that Paul made up Christianity are getting history wrong. They're not treating history properly. and
that's the problem. That's the exact problem right there. It's that,
they're not doing history properly,
right? Because there is the method, the historical method, and they're not, and they purposely do not follow it because they know that if you did use that, the historicity of their and that methodology could then therefore be used against the Quran, the Hadith, and all and the Sirah. So they avoid it like the plague, and they denounce those who would dare to criticize that or their ability to use that methodology as being somehow hate or bigot, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and the thing is, they've got a number of problems in terms of authorship, like of the Gospels. They've got to establish. They base their argument on the fact that, well, these are anonymous authors of the Gospels, as if that proves anything. If I write a letter, Eric, that has all your bank details on and your address and all the rest of it, and then I publish it, and I do it anonymously, does that change any of the facts on the page? Is a truth still a truth, even if it's written anonymously?
No, of course not. No.
Exactly. So the whole argument is a fallacious argument, but there's substantial evidence that we can claim for the authorship of the Gospels. Firstly, it's attested to very clearly in the Church Fathers, and I am desperately, whilst I'm talking, trying to find which Church Fathers said which ones.
Well,
but
that. Okay. Well,
go on.
Irenaeus. Okay, you have Jesus, John, then you have Polycarp, Polycarp, Ignatius, Papias, and then you have Irenaeus, who was a student of Polycarp, listing all four Gospels.
Okay, so like you've done it for me, but yes, we've got the four Gospels are clearly named with their authors. You've also got the fact that yes. Right. You've also got the fact that there's no extant manuscript that gives a different author.
Right.
If it was just being made up, then you would expect there to be some kind of argument over who authored the Gospels, different people arguing over it. We know that the church wasn't frightened to argue over the authorship of the church, because you see arguments over some of the epistles later in the church with Christians arguing over who wrote what. But no one argues about the authorship of the Gospels. It's just universally accepted, which means that it's a super early tradition. There's no material evidence to support different authorships or made-up authorships, and you've got early witness to the fact that they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
You mentioned something earlier about the anonymity of the authors somehow being problematic. And I can't.
No, I was saying that it's a moot point.
No. But I'm saying that being used as an argument to be problematic to the who the authors were. But I've read some. I can't remember where it is. I might have to look it up. But my understanding is that when biographies were written in the first century, the biographers, normally it was the norm to maintain their anonymity, to be anonymous. So you have a dual standard here. You say, okay, if you do have if you know who the author is, then therefore we know that this was not a first century document, because in the first century, when people wrote biographies, they maintained their anonymity. Well, then if you have somebody that is writing anonymously, and you say, well, we don't know who wrote the gospel because it was anonymous, then you deny it that way. So it's, heads I win, tails you lose. They try to formulate that argument, but the argument actually works in the opposite direction for those people who make that silly claim.
It is, yeah. It's a totally bogus. And I actually had Dr. Mike Lacona on my channel, and we talked about that. And you're quite right that it was a completely normal thing not to have the name of the author on the text. And so it isn't troublesome to classical scholars, the idea that you might have an anonymous writer, because all documentation, especially biographies, were anonymous. That's normal. But nobody doubts the authorship of these other texts. So even though they're later ascribed to the text that they're concerned with, I can't remember her name, but particularly the author of the biographies of the Caesars, whose name I can't remember. I want to say Platonius, but I'm thinking I might be making that up. But yeah, it's kind of normal, and we do see that in the Gospels as well. The reason why there's no isnad chains, guys, is because the isnad is literally one. It's one. It's Matthew. It's Mark. It's Luke. That's why. So I don't. Yeah, it's a really bad argument. I'm trying to not be personal. But it doesn't keep him
from making it, though, does it?
It doesn't stop him from making it. But I'm trying not to be. I'm trying to not get too personal.
No, and I
just stick to the argument.
Yeah, because you have to be out there with these guys on a weekly basis. I have an entire ocean where I don't have to worry about them doing anything nasty. Okay, you want to go to the next video?
Yeah, can do.
Where he talks about prayer. So let's just. He starts off the video. It's and actually he has some really good cinematographics for his channel. I got to hand it to him. I still like my intro, so it doesn't matter.
All right.
Okay, let's go ahead and play this. This is about a minute long, so we're gonna have to stick with me on this. Let's make this full screen and play.
So when I show you that now, then what?
Fell on his face and prayed.
No. When I show you in your Bible that Jesus fell to his knees with his head in the dirt, no, when I show you,
I am going to check first of all.
Wait, stop. Yeah. You just one second. You just said nowhere in the Bible does it say that. So are you lying or you don't know?
Excuse me. You need to be more like this is the discussion.
No, this is exposing you.
No.
This is no discussion.
It's not.
I'm not here to discuss.
This is like your ignorance.
Ignorance.
Yeah.
My ignorance.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
You're the one who doesn't know what's in his Bible, and I'm the ignorant one.
Yes, I do know. Yes, I do know.
Right. So if I show you,
you need to be more peaceful and not stop shouting. This is not.
Okay. I won't.
Yeah.
I won't. Forgive me.
Yeah, no.
If I show you.
Okay, so he's making this claim that Jesus prayed like a Muslim. Why is it so important for them to say that Jesus prayed like a Muslim? And I'm sure we're going to go through how Jesus did everything but pray like a Muslim. So go ahead and have at it.
Yeah, so they make this argument because firstly, they're used to Christians having no reply. And it has a shock value. Jesus prays like a Muslim, not like you pray. You don't prostrate in prayer. And so it has a shock value as a polemic, but also they have a need to try and claim Jesus as a Muslim because obviously they believe that all the prophets were Muslims and therefore Isa has to be a Muslim. So they need some kind of evidence to back it up. Now, the irony is that in the very next breath, when you disprove their argument, their counter to that is to say, well, the Bible's not believable, it's not trustworthy, but it's only trustworthy when we can use it for our purposes. And usually the argument goes along the lines of quoting one isolated verse from, the books of Moses, another isolated verse, say, from the book of Jeremiah, another isolated verse from the book of Haggai, and then another isolated verse from one of the Gospels, and then they draw this seamless line as if to say, look, everyone prayed like this, and it's just it's completely dishonest. It's intellectually dishonest. It's academically dishonest, and it's a busted sales pitch. And the reason why it's a busted sales pitch is I'm going to ask you to go to, please. Could you go to Mark 11:25?
Sure. Mark 11, verse 25. I got it right here. And whenever you stand... Okay,
stop. So, go on. Read it again.
And whenever you stand praying,
stop.
Forgive... What?
So Jesus is saying, when you stand praying.
That's a textual variant.
Yes, that is not a problem. Because there are other verses in the scripture where Jesus does this. If you
No,
turn
I'm kidding.
to-
I was kidding about that. I'm just saying.
Oh, you're really right.
That's got to be a variant. Instead of standing really doesn't mean standing.
I thought you'd got some note
No,
there
no,
to say
no,
it was
no.
textual variant,
No,
and then I was just going to do exactly what I said do earlier, which is I was just going to go to another verse to say the same thing.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Okay, go ahead. What was that verse? You want me to bring that one up too?
No. So also go. So Christ is saying in Mark 11:25, when you stand praying. So he assumes that the normative position of prayer is to stand. Yeah, look at how he applies that to himself. If you turn to John 17:1 and read that.
Okay, John 17, verse 1. And when Jesus had spoken these words, he lifted his eyes up to heaven and said, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son that the Son may glorify you.
Yeah. So here Jesus is saying he's standing and he is looking up to heaven. Muslims aren't allowed to look up to heaven when they pray. That's forbidden to them. Jesus is standing in prayer. He's not prostrating in prayer. Let's go to. Do you know the parable the parable of the sinner and the tax collector?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to pull that passage up?
Okay.
I can't remember it off the top of my head.
I'll find it.
Yeah. So let's just find another one. Bear with us. Bear with me 1 second. Could
that be Luke 18? Luke 18, verses 9 to 14.
Yeah, do you just want to read that, please?
Yes, and he told this parable to someone who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed, thus, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust adulterers, even like this tax collector. I fast twice. Look at that. He's fasting here. Fast twice a week. Give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift his eyes up to heaven, but beat his breast. He was standing far off.
There you go. So you've got, even when Christ is telling a parable that involves prayer, the parable that involves prayer assumes that the normative position of prayer is standing. Now, I don't know if you know this, but in Islam, there are times of prayer that are forbidden. Did you know that?
There what?
There are times where salah is haram.
Times, okay.
Yeah, times in the day when salah is haram.
I did not know that, no.
So after the sunrise, if I understand it correctly, and I'm sure a Muslim will correct me, but the basic message is correct, that the after sunrise, or as the sun is rising and as the sun sets and as the sun is in its zenith, you can't pray at these moments in time. So there is strictly there are places where when Muslims cannot perform salah. But if you turn to the passage where Jesus tells the story of the unjust judge and the widow.
Luke, it's also in Luke 18, is it? Luke 18, verse 3. And there was a widow in that city who kept coming and saying, give me justice against my adversary. For a while he refused, but afterward he said to himself, though I neither fear God nor respect man, yet this widow kept bothering him. I will give her justice so that she will not beat me down by her continual coming. And the Lord said, hear what the unrighteous judge says. And God will not.
It's okay. Did you catch that bit when he was talking about? But I was reading whilst you were writing. Did you catch the bit about praying always?
No, I did not see that. For maybe afterward he said to himself, nothing fear and respect man. Kept bothering him. I will give her justice so he will not beat she will not beat me down by her continuing coming. And the Lord said, hear what unrighteous. No, I don't see that. I'm sorry. Maybe I missed it.
Then. I'll find it.
Day and night. I will tell you, give them justice.
So I tried a new system.
Maybe I'm in the wrong verse.
No, bear with us 1 second. It won't take me a minute.
Unjust judge. Oh no! It says right there in the first verse. I started. It says,
read it.
He told them a parable to the effect that they ought always to pray and not lose heart. Okay.
Yeah. So Christ says to always pray. Christ says to always pray, right. And Muslims tell one another not to pray at certain times. Christ also, when you think about the substance of prayer, how do we address God?
Well, we pray in spirit.
Yeah, we pray in the spirit. That is true. But when we make petitionary prayer, what is our term of address? Do we call God?
Our Father.
Yes. Our Father,
Our
exactly.
Father. As a matter of fact, the model prayer. I have this.
Yeah, and that is the model prayer. The model prayer is the Our Father prayer. And if you compare the Our Father prayer, Muslim prayers don't match it. Muslims do not address God as Father. So not only does Jesus call God Father, not only does he say that the normative position of prayer is standing, not only does he say that your eyes should be looking up to heaven, he also prays in the temple, and he prays on a Sabbath as a special day of prayer. None of these things Muslims do. None of these things Muslims do. When, for instance, the one verse that Muslims go to is the idea of prostration in prayer, that Jesus prostrates, as if Islam either invented or owns prostration. It would take me it'll take you 2 minutes to find a video, or just type in Christians prostrating in prayer. Okay. And just to prove it, Christians were using prostration in prayer for centuries before Islam. They didn't invent the practice, and they don't own the practice. It is not that Jesus prays like a Muslim. It is that Jesus prays like a Jew, and Muslims are copying Jews.
Okay.
And Christians, when we prostrate in prayer, we are copying Jews. They didn't invent it. They don't own it. And it isn't that Jesus prayed like a Muslim. It's that they are praying like a Jew. Here's an example of a Christian prostrating in prayer.
This is,
What they're chanting there is Kyrie eleison.
I didn't hear that.
Lord have mercy. And notice that. Go on, bro.
No, I was just saying this is Armenian Christians doing this, and a lot of us are insulated here in the West, where we don't see these Orthodox practices going on. And it's just like you said, it isn't like this was invented by Muhammad. This is something that has been practiced since the earliest church, and also in Judaism. They prostrate themselves in Judaism also. So this isn't the
exactly
exclusive Islamic practice at all by any stretch of imagination.
Yeah, and we see Paul building, exactly as we said earlier, Paul builds on this in 1 Thessalonians 5:17, where he says, pray without ceasing. Also in Philippians 4:6 and 7, where he says to the church to pray in all situations. So, for example, he says, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, which is exactly what our Lord did. So, yeah, it's a really dumb argument, and the only people that propagate it are really dumb people. And if you're a Christian in the West and you're not using prostration in prayer, I want to encourage you to do it. It isn't Islamic. Muslims don't own it. Jesus did it, and we should do it as well.
Well, what I would point out also, if you go to Matthew chapter 6, where because we all know that the Muslims, they have certain prayers that they have to give, and each of the 5 different prayers that they give during the day. And
Yeah.
here's what Jesus says. He says, "And when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites, for they love to play standing in synagogues and corners in the street, that they may be seen by men. Assured they say they have the word, but when you no, that wasn't the one. It was where he says, do not keep making the same type of repetitious prayers.
Do not use repetitions in prayer. It's the three good works that he speaks about in the Gospels: prayer, fasting, and alms.
Yeah, verse 7, it says, and when you pray, do not use vain repetitions as heathens do. And what do the Muslims pray? 5 times a day. The same prayer. Well, they pray different prayers for each one, but it's the same repetitious prayer.
Yeah.
And he also goes on, and I'm going to double tap what you said before, as far as who are we praying to. When Jesus teaches us how to pray, the first sentence is, "Our Father who art in heaven." So we're praying to our Father, and who cannot call Allah? Allah is the Father to nobody. So even when we start talking about how Jesus prayed or how we should pray as Christians, it's actually the exact opposite of what this clown is trying to get this guy to believe here at Speaker's Corner.
Yep. You're absolutely right. And the reality is that in terms of Christ's teaching about how you practice good work, like almsgiving, like fasting, and like prayer, Christ's teaching actually condemns the mainstream practices of Muslims. They boast constantly of how they're fasting. Like, you can't get through a Ramadan without everyone knowing that they're fasting.
Right.
They make a public spectacle of their virtue, praying in the street, making a big deal about their fasting, which is not really fasting. It's just skipping lunch and having 2 giant feasts. And they also make a big deal about, I've given my zakat. And the reality is that zakat's not even a charity. It's a tax that they have to pay, punishable by death if they don't. You're an apostate if you refuse to pay the tax. And it's not even charity because, Christians, Jews, Hindus, they can't benefit from zakat. Only a Muslim can benefit from zakat. So it's not even charity. And Christ condemns all of that because of the public nature in which it is done. You can't do a tax in private. It's a public thing. And so the truth is that actually, and most Muslims don't do the 5 daily prayers. Most Muslims don't. Well, a huge chunk don't give zakat. And the reality is that Islam has failed them in terms of this. Whereas Christ's teaching about doing all these things privately, not letting anyone see your good works, and I feel the weight and the conviction of Christ's teaching in my own life at the moment, for just with the stuff I'm going through, is the importance of you doing things for God, not doing things for how other people might perceive you.
Right.
And as someone who does a lot of stuff on YouTube in public, I very much am feeling the weight of what Christ is teaching.
Right. And that's part of the focus that a lot of us, and I find myself in the same situation, not nearly as big as yours, of course, but looking to satisfy my own desires, my own feelings on these shows. And I keep forgetting that, the audience of the people that we're trying to, because I don't make any bones about it. My show is specifically to build up the ability of the Christian to, number one, to defend their faith, but also to build up their ability to openly criticize, and know the good criticisms of Islam. That it's not necessarily dedicated to winning Muslims over, but it's more focused on the Christians and their faith. Because, let's face it, the Christians, and like a lot of Muslims, I guess you can make the same analogy, are very ignorant of what the Bible teaches and what their faith teaches, and they're very susceptible to these attacks. So it's best used to equip the Christian to defend and to attack. It's kind of like what's that, Deuce Vault, that Crusaders, yes, that you like to use. As a matter of fact, I have that on my. And if you watch the opening, I have that on the.
I did see it. I just want to point out one more thing.
Okay.
Which is that which is that morning prayer in the I'm going to mispronounce this as well, Shakarit, which is a Jewish book talking about Jewish traditions of prayer, daily prayer, and the set times that they were done, which Jesus would have followed. You also find it in the Minsha, is ideally done between the 9th and the 12th hour of the day, or between dawn and the 4th hour of the day, which means that Jesus was praying at times expressly forbidden for Muslims to pray at. So clearly Jesus didn't pray like a Muslim.
And he wasn't a Muslim.
And he definitely wasn't a Muslim.
Well,
Definitely was not a Muslim.
That's another argument that they make.
That's a different argument, but this is a really broke argument, and sadly, it just shows the low IQ of the people that make this argument.
Well, the boldness from which he posts this. I mean, this guy has how many? I mean, he's a very like you said, he's a very popular.
He's not intelligent, but he's popular.
Look at this. He's got 500. Let me put this up here. He's got. Whoops. Did I miss it? I didn't miss it. Okay, let me put it back up here. This guy has 412,000 subscribers.
Yeah.
And this video alone got 94,000 views. That is
if you want to be a grifter, become an Islamic YouTuber. It's a quick way to make a profit. And sadly, I think that economics speaks to people, and so you're going to see an increase in that because it's just a quick way to get subs and a quick way to make money. So if you want to be a grifter, that's the way to go. But if you're in it for truth, then you follow the harder path that me and Eric are on.
and I think that's what they're doing. Him and who are those other two? Muhammad Hijab, Ali Dawa, and but those guys aren't on EF Dawa, are they? Are they part of that group?
No, I don't. I mean, I'm not going to comment as to the motives. I'm just pointing out that if you want to be a grifter, this is the way to go.
Okay.
Yeah, you want to make money. You just.
Well, that's what Kenny Bomer in his debate with David Wood was accusing David Wood of. You look at it; he's making all this money criticizing Islam. That's his sole motivation is to make this money.
Yeah.
Well, he makes a substantial amount of money doing it, but that's not his sole motivation because.
How does that apply then to some of the popular Islamic YouTubers? Do you know what I'm saying? It's like if you're going to take this logic, apply it consistently.
Exactly.
I mean, I'm pretty much done with that silly argument. I can't see. I mean, we could obviously go over the same territory again in even more detail with even more references, but it feels to me like we've kind of smashed it.
I think she sums it up, Latia. She sums it up best. He's an idiot. Yeah, okay. I love the bluntness of sometimes of the people that come to the channel every Sunday.
Oh no, sorry. Just another thing that occurred to me: Christians sing. They sing psalms. Muslims don't sing. Singing is haram.
Why is that? Do you have any idea? I don't.
Off the top of my head, no, but it wouldn't take me long to find out. But there's a lot of Muslims that think it's probably one of the legal law schools. It's not universal, but one of the legal law schools. I think it's Hanbal. Oh, flipping it names. Me and names. They forbid singing. One of the legal law schools, but it's not universal. But the point is, you don't go to mosque to sing. But Christians go to church and we sing, and Jews went to the temple and they also sang as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but this is supposed to be part of the three great faiths coming out of the Abrahamic tradition.
That's a load of rubbish. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, shall we go on to the next video then?
Okay, this one, the audio is hard to hear. I'm just going to be, let's stop. Okay, it's hard to hear. I'm just going to be perfectly honest with you. But this one deals with, is the Bible historically correct? And I want everybody to listen to Hamza's argument against the Bible and for Islam. And he's pointing out that Pharaoh, this is the argument he's making, that the Pharaoh at the time of Joseph the title was not Pharaoh. It was supposed to be king. And what he's saying is that only a divinely inspired document, a divinely inspired man would know this. So here's his argument. Let me go ahead and put this up here. Is the Bible historically correct? All right, let me make it big for everybody to see. And here we go.
This is not subjective. This is proof. Okay. If you read your Bible in the Old Testament and the story of Joseph, you know the story of Joseph? Goes in the well, comes out of the well, goes to prison, ends up being advisor to the leader of Egypt. Yeah. According to your Bible, who is the leader of Egypt? What's his name? What's his title?
They could not imitate it, copy it. They couldn't understand how it was the century.
Then we come to the story of Moses. And who is the title of the leader of Egypt then?
There was more than 120,000 prophets.
Pharaoh. Okay. When did the Pharaonic dynasty become into existence?
Oh, I heard something about that recently, and it has been refuted what you're saying. I can't remember.
That's convenient.
That's convenient. Going to go there.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you historically, because this man likes history. The Pharaonic dynasty, in the time of Joseph, they were known as kings. And it was only later on they became pharaohs. Yeah? Now, here's the amazing thing, because I want to bring the Quran in, because you like to control the Quran in.
Because the Quran means Pharaoh, yeah.
The Bible. No. This is the thing, you see. The Quran doesn't. The Quran calls the leader of Egypt in the time of Joseph king.
All right. So he was making the argument that it is a miracle of the Quran, where at the time of Moses got it right, saying that the Pharaoh was known as the Pharaoh. But when we use the historical method, and this is what amazes me, he actually wants to use the historical method to determine what the title of the Pharaoh was at the time of Joseph. He was referred to as a king, and nowhere in history does it do this. He goes on, he makes other arguments saying, well, this is the only place that we can find it is in the Quran.
Well, I mean, firstly, that's just opened up the Quran to a whole world of pain. If we're talking about anachronisms, right. Then like I've got a bunch of juicy fruit of anachronistic nonsense in the Quran that right. I'll talk about in a second. But I think it's fair to say that now, if I get my facts right, the time in which the Joseph story is set is the Middle Kingdom period, which is like 2055 BC to 1650 BC. So somewhere in that period of time is where the Joseph story is set. And it's true to say that the term Pharaoh wasn't common. It wasn't widespread. It became more widespread later in the sort of New Kingdom period, so 1550 to 1069, which is obviously when the story of Moses right. is set. And at that point, Pharaoh would become much more involved. But the fact of the matter is, we do have historical artifacts dated to the Middle Kingdom that do use the term Pharaoh. Not many of them, admittedly, but we do have them. So one example would be Senusret. There in the Middle Kingdom, there's a stele in the reign of Senusret, which is dated 1971 to 1926 before Christ, and it refers to him as Pharaoh in one of the inscriptions. Another example.
Okay, so what you're saying is that during the same kingdom that he's saying that the Pharaoh was only referred to as king,
we've got artifacts that say Pharaoh.
That say, okay, it was Pharaoh. Okay,
not many, and it wasn't common. King was a much more popular term, a much more commonly used term, but Pharaoh was used. So, for example, so it's not a case that one is right and the other is wrong. But Pharaoh, it's a case that, I to my understanding, and I'm not an Egyptologist, but to my understanding, it's a case that they're both right. They both can be right. So another example would be there's a statue of Amenemhat III, which dates to 1842 to 1797 before Christ BC. And again, that uses the title Pharaoh. And so that clearly demonstrates that the term Pharaoh was and had been used in the period of time that the Joseph story is set. Now, let's imagine that evidence wasn't there for a second. Why might, at the time of Moses, when Moses was telling the story about Pharaoh, when Moses was telling the story about Joseph to the Jews who'd just come out of Egypt under Pharaoh's whip, why might Moses have used the word Pharaoh to speak to these ignorant slaves? Because
they would have it. They would, because this is what the common term that was
that
used
they would have been familiar with.
Right. They wouldn't. So they would not get confused with who the office holder was. Right.
Exactly. That's exactly, so even if it's a case of, even if we didn't have archaeological evidence to back up the fact that Pharaoh was a term used in the Middle Kingdom, which we do, the reality is that Moses is communicating to a bunch of ignorant slaves about something that happened well into the past, in which the ruler, which they would have known as a pharaoh, needs to be described in a way that they understand. So you would call them pharaoh. So I don't see much of a problem with it.
And that's the point. When we start looking at why it was written the way it was, it is the connection that the Jews make with that office. But it gets worse, and I'm not sure if you were aware of this.
Go on.
If you go to Genesis chapter 40 and verse 1.
Bear with us. I will do exactly that. Genesis chapter 40.
Verse 1 and 2.
Verse 1. And I'll read it. After these things, I'm reading from Net Bible.
Okay.
After these things happened, the cupbearer to the king of Egypt and the royal baker.
What? The what?
To the king of Egypt.
Okay,
the king of Egypt. Yeah. To the king of Egypt and the royal baker offended their master, the king of Egypt.
The who?
Pharaoh was enraged with his two officials, the cupbearer and the baker.
Okay, so the miracle that he's claiming, how could he possibly know this? Well, if somebody just would have read the book of Genesis to him, he did not have to go through. And this is the argument he goes on to make. He says, well, what did he did he know how to read the hieroglyphics, the Egyptian hieroglyphics? How could he possibly know this? And he gets away with it.
From a Jew who read it from the Hebrew Bible. Oh, wait. And there was loads of Jews in Medina, apparently, that he knew.
Yeah, some miracle, right? And then he continues. He continues, and he's debating in this video. He's debating a Jew, about, on this, and the Jew is obviously I don't want to say he's ignorant, but he was just ignorant of this passage. And when I first listened to it, I was like, well, that doesn't sound right. How can somebody change the name of? And this is where I went in, and you go in and Google this stuff and look it up, and you can. It points to all the counter arguments to the supposed miracle that we find in the Quran. And when we look at it, it's like the miracle of embryology. How could Muhammad possibly know? Well, he didn't know, number one, because what he outlines in the embryological cycle is incorrect. Yeah. But the fact is that these were stories that already had circulated and were circulated in 7th century Arabia. So it's not, there's no miracle involved here.
Exactly. And it gets worse. It gets worse because what he's done is he's essentially tried to, at the same time as try to claim a miracle that doesn't exist, he's also made an argument from historical anachronism. Mm-hmm. And there's historical anachronisms in the Quran. So I'm sure you know the one about the Samaritan. So the Quran talks about a Samaritan,
Mount Sinai? Right?
Yeah, at Mount Sinai at the time of Moses. That's not my particular favorite, but my particular favorite is chainmail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and so the Quran in Surah 34 says, commanding, make thou coats of mail. By the way, people in the past didn't call chainmail, they just called it mail. Mm-hmm. Because chainmail, it's a redundant term. Balancing well the rings of chain armor and work ye righteousness, for be sure I see all that ye do. And he's talking to David. So he's talking to King David in the Quran, and he's saying that they had chainmail. The thing about chainmail is that militaristically, it's a good form of armor that gave people an advantage, which is why it became, once it had been invented, why it became so popular. But when was chainmail invented? That's the point. Right. And when you look into it, chainmail, bear with us 1 second. I'm just trying to pull up my notes. So I tried to use this new system to create my notes, and it's quite complicated.
It's like the 6th century BC or something like that?
Yeah, so basically, no, sorry, bear with us. It might take me a second to find it. It is essentially the 5th century, yeah, it is.
5th century, okay.
So I just want to see if I can find it. Bear with us.
I have 3 other anachronisms that I want to bring up just when you get done with this, because it's absolutely priceless. Where he's going to the same story, where he's going to a story that he's saying that the Bible is anachronistic in naming the Pharaoh as Pharaoh, when the Bible does describe him as a king. So it throws the legitimacy of the supposed miracle out the window, but it also, using his criteria, demonstrates the exactness and the historicity of the Bible record itself. Because if this is not known, how is this supposed to be known to Moses if he was not aware of these things and lived at this time?
So chainmail is something that bear with us. I do apologize. I will find it.
I think it wasn't even invented. It was invented. Was invented by the Celts, I think.
Yeah,
it was something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, basically. Nope. Yeah. Okay. So I couldn't find exactly the note that I was looking for, which is a shame. But essentially, chainmail is invented. Chainmail was invented at the time of the Celts. It's somewhere between the 5th and the 3rd centuries before Christ.
Okay.
Which is well too late for it to be, it's either the Celts or the ancient Greeks that invented chainmail. Okay. And they did it around the 3rd century. I found my note now. So one of the earliest examples that we have of chainmail's invention is the burial site of Jakobsberg, Germany, which is a 3rd century burial site. The thing about technology, especially technology that catches on and becomes successful, is that as it moves forward in time, the evidence for it begins to expand. Yeah, like that. So you can think about the first phone. When is it Alexander Graham Bell invented the first phone, or the first is it Alexander Graham Bell? I think he was the guy. Yeah. So when he invented the first phone and discovered that Chuck Norris had left him 3 voice messages already, as a joke, Chuck Norris joke. Never mind.
That's
straight over your head. Straight over your head.
Right. That's a great anachronism.
It was an anachronism. Yeah. But when Graham Alexander invented the phone, you can archaeologically trace out the spread of the phone as a device that then becomes a universal device from the point at the bottom called Alexander Graham Bell. In other words, as you go closer to its emergence, to its invention as technology, the evidence for its existence gets thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner. Well, it's the same with chainmail. Well, all our evidence points to the fact that chainmail was something that was invented just a few centuries before Christ, probably 3rd century before Christ. By the time you get to Muhammad, it's a very popular, but there's no evidence of it existing really before the 3rd century. And that means that you've got an anachronism here in the Quran, because it's saying that if chainmail had been invented by David 1,000 years BC, let's say, then that means that something that is an effective weaponry didn't catch on of course it would have caught on, because it would have give the people an advantage in conflict.
Right, it's much lighter than the plate mail that was normally
Than
used.
plate armor, which would have been the actual plate armor and leaf armor are the two kinds of armor that were used around the Iron Age. And chainmail would have given people a massive military advantage because of the increased mobility. The idea that it would have been invented at the time of David and not caught on is ridiculous. And history doesn't support that. So you've got an anachronism right here in the Quran. That's my first one. You do one and I'll do another.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and point towards Pharaoh himself, where he starts talking about, if he's going to opine about Pharaoh and what Pharaoh did and, being called king and such. I'm going to go with Quran 7:124 and Quran 2:26-49. 724 or 124 says, I will show Pharaoh, speaking here, is I will surely cut off your hands and your feet on the opposite sides. Then I will crucify you all. And then chapter 26, verse 49, he says, you believed Moses before I gave permission. Indeed, he is your leader. He has taught you magic. But you are going to know I will surely cut off your hands and your feet on opposite sides, and I will surely crucify you. Now, there's a number of things that are wrong with this. Number one, the same Pharaoh, the evil Pharaoh of the Bible and of the Quran, uses the same methodology of punishing people as we find in the Quran. I think it's in Quran 5:33, where it talks about, for causing mischief in the land. Am I right on? I'm fairly sure. If I'm not, it's something like that.
Crucifixion is listed as a punishment in the Quran.
Right. Okay. So Pharaoh is using, or God, the God of the universe, is using the same type of punishment that the Pharaoh used at the time of Moses. The problem with this, why it's anachronistic, is that crucifixion was not developed until the 6th century BC by the Persians. So here you have Moses, who lived 1500 BC, somewhere around there, is using a process to execute people that had not been invented won't be invented for over another 900 years. So again, when we start talking about anachronisms, and he's going to say, "Oh, the Bible's anachronistic." No, it's not. The only thing that we share here is the belief in your belief in the Quran and your inability to discern whether or not there are anachronisms within the Quran, which there clearly are, and this is just one of them. There are more. You go ahead.
I've got another one for you. So the Quran mentions that Joseph was sold for a certain number of dirhams.
Right.
Do you know that story?
Yes, very familiar with it. Yes.
Yeah. So he sold for dirhams. Now, the thing about the dirham is that it's derived from the Greek term drachma. So it's basically just an Arabized version of the term drachma. So it's saying, in essence, that Joseph was sold for some drachmas. But the problem with that is that the story is anachronistic because the drachma as a currency wasn't invented until the classical period, around the 5th century BC. So the idea that Joseph, who is possibly up to 1,000, 2,000?
Joseph is 1800, 1900 BC.
1800.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea that they had the drachma in 1800 BC, when it was only invented in the 5th century BC, is massively anachronistic.
Right.
And if Hamza is going to say that the Bible is in error because it's got these anachronisms, well, so does the Quran. So is he going to be consistent now and chuck the Quran away? Of course he's not. He's going to invent some special pleading. He's going to invent this rule applies to the Bible, but not the Quran kind of logic. And unfortunately, that is the level of debate that exists amongst Muslim polemicists. So,
there's not a lot of depth to that argument either. And I've read the article. If you go to, is it Islamic Awareness? It's kind of a big site that provides excuses. Yeah. Their excuses, the rescuing devices.
Yeah.
And there's two other additional things about that. Three actually additional things about that is, number one, coins did not even exist, period, at the time of Joseph. Coins were not used as a currency until I think it's like the 8th or 7th, 8th, 9th. It's a long time after this, 1,000 years after this, number one.
Yeah.
The second thing is that, as you said, they're using a form of a currency, because it does say "and counted out." When you look at that verse, it says "counted out."
Yeah.
Now we can make the argument today that the shekel, when it talks about shekels being used as a currency at the time of Joseph, this is true, but a shekel is not, at that time, was not considered a coin. It was considered a weighted amount.
Yeah.
So you could make the argument that the drachma or the dirham is what the Quran uses, which is a derivative of that. Anyway, you can make that argument that said, well, look there, the dirham was a weighted amount also, but that's not true because it says counted out. If it didn't say counted out, you might have an argument about that, but they always leave that out. And then thirdly, the Bible, using archaeological evidence, names the price that is for Joseph that was paid that is completely consistent to what we find in the Bible itself. So that's a great anachronism when we talk that Hamza, I'm sure, would never be able to even, to try to defend. Maybe try to get you to follow him around Speaker's Corner.
The thing is, I've tried to debate Hamza twice on the Quran, and twice he's ran away. The thing with Hamza is that he only argues with he wants to grandstand in front of the camera, and he argues against Christians that he thinks that he can win about, and he only wants to argue about the Bible. He only wants to argue about Christianity so that he can play his catchphrases like Jesus prayed like a Muslim. But the moment you flip it on him and you start challenging him about anything to do with the Quran or Islam, like I have done twice, he's ran away twice. He's an intellectual coward. And if he wants to debate, I'm happy to debate him at the corner or on a live stream. I've challenged him to a debate. He said he was going to do it, and then he backed off and ran away, and then went home and then uploaded a video saying, I'm not going to debate him. So, that actions speak louder than words, guys.
And you see these guys literally running away from you. Who's that little fella that keeps taunting you?
Siraj.
Siraj. There you go. Oh my goodness,
he's just a pest.
That's what I was thinking. Why don't you just squash the guy and say, "Go away"?
He's just looking to be. He just wants clickbait. He's looking to make a name for himself. He thinks that he's going to do it through YouTube, and so he just comes and he rudely interrupts every conversation that I've been doing. Though recently he's backed off from doing that. I think that either people have had a word in his ear, or he's just cottoned on that if he interrupts me, I go and interrupt some Dawa. And he's left me alone, so I've left them alone.
Good.
Like the intellectual battle has been won between Christianity and Islam. And the beauty is the victory is not ours, the victory is Christ's, who defeated them through his cross, which disproves Islam 100%. And his resurrection, which also beautifully disproves Islam. But the intellectual battle has been won. The only thing that the reason why that hasn't caught on is because a lot of Christians don't involve themselves in apologetics polemics. A lot of Christians still follow a very timid, limp-wristed kind of Christianity, and Islam has sociological power for reasons that can be both understood and countered. Like if we win all the arguments, but they end up controlling all the police forces and the courts and the council seats, we still lose. Doesn't matter if you win all the intellectual arguments, and they recognize that. And we beat them over 2 years, not just me, but Jay Smith and Hatun Tash as well. We beat them over a number of years, and latterly for me, the first 2 years that I was at the corner. And after being mauled week after week after week, for 104 weeks, more or less, they decided to try and organize a boycott because it was costing them. It was costing them in that people were becoming Christian because of what we're doing, and they knew it. And so why risk an argument that you could lose when you can just speak to a Christian who doesn't know anything and look like you're an amazing debater who's confused and confounded another Christian? So my encouragement is Christians, stop going onto their channels. Christians, stop going to the corner to talk to them. And stop giving them cannon fodder.
Yeah, and you always have the group of clapping seals that accompany these guys that want to Allah Akbaria.
Well, the other thing is that pressure of expectancy. You know, when you're surrounded by a group and you can feel the pressure of their expectancy, if you're young, naive and malleable, and then someone says, well, I think it's time that you say your shahada, and then you feel this expectancy of the group, this peer pressure as people expect you to say your shahada. If you're suggestible and naive, then unfortunately a lot of people say their shahada. How many of those actually go on to practice it is a different question. You know,
I wonder if there's like a Pew Research.
There are lots of studies.
Okay.
Like loads of studies show that most Muslims stop practicing Islam within 7 years of becoming Muslim.
Really?
Like, yeah. It's almost as many people leave Islam as come into it.
So right? You have conversions, you have apostasy.
Yes, but the thing is, they've got a higher birth rate.
Right. Yeah.
And so the numbers go up. And then in Western world, you've not just got a higher birth rate, but you've also got higher levels of migration from Muslim countries, whilst you've got a collapsing Western demographic. So even though there are lots of Muslims leaving Islam, the reality is that in the Western world, it's counted by the high birth rate and the high migration. And in the Muslim world, it's counted by the higher birth rate, because every Muslim born is counted as a Muslim, even if a certain percentage of Muslims have left in adulthood or stopped practicing.
Yeah, this is a question that we handled on the show. I think it was this past Sunday where we handled this question on the show. I think it's Latia, who's in the audience right now, asked that question. How do you deal with that? And we went in and we said essentially what you're saying is that a lot of it has to do with birth rate. But the good news is the apostasy rate that we see now that all of this information that you and I have been talking, just some of the information that you and I have been talking about here on the show, is becoming more widely available to them. And when they are able to have access to it, which they are not allowed to have access to in a lot of these Muslim majority countries, by the way, but they do get access to it. This is like, what do you mean this is true? What do you mean that Muhammad did this? What do you and they can't believe that these things are true and that people would have the actual audacity to be saying them publicly. How dare you? That's blasphemy.
There's a tsunami of apostasy going on.
Yes.
It's a tsunami. It's happening everywhere. And I want to say to you, if you're a Muslim watching this, you don't have to stay in Islam. Loads of Muslims are leaving it. You can leave it as well. And I would invite you to pick up, a Bible, pick up scripture, and to consider actually, what Christianity teaches, and come and speak to someone like me or someone like Eric, someone who actually does know the faith, and is willing to sit and talk with you about what it means. Even if you don't choose to accept it, at least be informed so that you know what you're not accepting. And that can't hurt you. It can't hurt you to do a sincere and honest inquiry into what Christians believe. It doesn't mean you have to believe it yourself, but it does mean that at least if you do decide not to believe it yourself, you know what you're rejecting. Because the reality is, what you hear in the mosque and what you hear amongst your Muslim friends is all ignorant, as we've been demonstrating with this video on Hamza. It's just nonsense. And I would encourage you, to come and speak to some knowledgeable Christians and discover the same Christ that we follow, which is the Father's Messiah, the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, the one who was crucified, died, rose again on the third day, and will come again to judge you and me and the living and the dead.
Amen. And amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, you want to end it there? We've been going. This is, I normally can only go 2 hours, and I don't have the stamina. I had Thaddeus from Reasoned Answers. Did you see him? His went 12 hours.
I know. I don't know how he does it. I am certainly not. I am certainly not one to be jumping on that one. I do want to I'll make one final point,
Okay.
and then we'll call it quits. How does that sound?
That sounds like a plan. Go ahead.
So, a lot of Muslims obviously believe that the Quran is this unique book, that Allah has revealed it, and that it's incomparable, and that it's an original, as it were, production of Allah through Muhammad. That's what Muslims believe. That's what they've been told to believe. That's what they believe is to be true. But the reality is that the Quran admits to something that I think a lot of Muslims miss. And I'm going to read from Surah 25, 4 and 5, where it says, "But the disbelievers say, naught is this but a lie which he has forged, and others have helped him at it. In truth, it is they who have put forward an iniquity and a falsehood. And they say, tales of the ancients, which he has caused to be written, and they are dictated to him morning and evening." So the Quran is saying that the early opponents of Muhammad said that Muhammad was just telling them stories that they'd heard before. And I want to show to you that this is true, and I'm going to give you the references so you can check it for yourself. Where Muhammad has clearly borrowed a story, sometimes identically, sometimes in a massaged or revised way, but he is essentially borrowing and taking stories from other sources, showing therefore that the Quran is not of divine origin. It is the make construction of a man or men who believed or who conspired to invent a religion and used other people's sources and materials to try and give it content. So in Surah 234, we've got the story of Satan being cast from heaven because he refused to bow to Adam. And this kind of story that you see in Surah 234 and also in other places of the Quran, because it appears multiple times. And if you do a synoptic analysis of that story, you see that it's retold differently in each telling, with different words and different orders of events. But that story is found in a book that we have access to, that you can find and research yourself, called The Life of Adam and Eve. It's a complete stealing of someone else's story. Surah 531 tells the story of Cain learning to bury Abel's body by watching a raven scratch the ground. Mm-hmm. And again, this story is found in several places in the Quran. But you can find that in Jewish midrash literature, like the Tanhuma and the Perkei, I'm probably mispronouncing this, Perkei de Eliezer. And these are, these are the Jewish midrashes that you can find that are telling a very similar story. Surah 532 tells a moral story with legal applications to the story of Cain and Abel and what happened between those two. And that application is taken from a 3rd century Jewish legal tradition in the Mishnah. And the Quran practically quotes word for word a portion of the Sanhedrin, part 4 and 5, part 4, verse 5. That
one right there.
Let me have a look.
Can you see it on the screen?
Oh yes, yeah. Oh, you've got it. So you've covered this already at some point. Then it's all over the place when you start talking about the drawing from previous sources, and that's a very popular one. You're absolutely right. So there you go. I mean, put that back up on screen so people can see it. Just for a second while I give my next example.
Yeah.
So for another example is Surah 21, which tells the story of Abraham destroying the idols in his homeland. Mm-hmm. Now, and then being delivered miraculously from fire by God. Now, that story is a Jewish legend recorded in the Midrash Rabbah. In Surah 7, 171, God is told. God speaks of holding a mountain over the Israelites like a canopy, so that they're not terrified that it's going to fall on them. And it ends by telling them to fear God and to remember the revelation that they've been given. That story is a rabbinic tradition recorded in the Babylonian Talmud.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could go on. I'll maybe do one more. So in Surah 19:22-26, it tells the story of Mary, who's still pregnant with Jesus at the time, traveling and being driven by the pains of childbirth to sit under a tree where she expects to die. A voice speaks to her from beneath and tells her to shake the tree, and she will be given both food and drink by the tree and will live. Right? Now, this story has its precedent, its antecedent in the pseudo-gospel of Matthew. The only difference is that Jesus is a 2-year-old boy in that story, and he commands the tree to bend down and to feed Mary fruit and drink. The stories are clearly of a man who's traveled around, heard stories orally, and either by choice or by accident has either misremembered them in retelling them or has manipulated them on purpose to create content for his book. And people called him out on it at the time, right, which is exactly what you would expect them to do if these were popularly known stories. So there's my final argument for closing.
Okay, so we have stories that are borrowed from pre-existent Quranic literature that we know existed prior to the Quran, and they, by the way, have several points of congruence, meaning they have several points. For example, the Queen of Sheba is kind of my favorite. That one has, let's see, I don't have it listed, but it has 15 different points of congruence, where you have the Queen of Sheba, which comes from the second Targum of Esther, and a 2nd century document.
Yeah.
And this story told in the Quran. Now, how is that possible? Well, here's the rescuing device. Those were stories that were inspired prior to the Quran, and Muhammad is just putting those out, or God is ensuring that those stories are put into sacred scripture so we can learn from them.
That's convenient.
Yeah. It's so convenient, right?
It's so convenient, isn't it? More likely that the man who had an obvious interest in religion and who traveled around for his first wife as a trader, and who hung around for years with Jews in Medina and knew Christians, quote mark, in Christians in his family through Khadijah, and spoke with monks on his travels, has heard a whole bunch of stories, some of which he remembered properly, some of which he didn't, and then just puts them in his Quran because he needed content. And this is what came to him, things that he'd already heard. I think that's far more likely, to be honest. And clearly the evidence supports that.
Occam's razor stuff, what is probably the most sensible answer is usually the right one on this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, then, brother.
Man, I cannot tell you how appreciative I am coming to this channel and sharing with us this morning. It's been a delight to hear some of your insights on, because I wrote down a bunch of stuff that when I was writing these clips down, and I'm like, he ain't covering any of this type of stuff. You have a completely different perspective, and that's what I really enjoy seeing here, because it enlightens those people who kind of get the same droning on that I provide on a weekly basis, and then you hear something new that comes from a completely different perspective, and basically does the same type of body slam that we do when it comes to people trying to propagate the Quran or trying to dismiss or at least try to mislead people away from our Christian Bible. So. Amen. Thank you so very much.
It's been a pleasure, Eric. I really appreciate your channel. I hope anyone who's searched for me and found you in this video, I want to encourage them to subscribe to Eric's channel. And I'm guessing it'll be all right to upload this onto my own channel.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what I'll do is I'll put the link to your channel. So if you're watching this on my channel, please use the link and also subscribe to Eric's channel, because he does some really great presentations, super informative, easy to follow. And it's always a pleasure hanging out with you, bro. And, you know, if we don't meet on one side of the lake, I'll see you on one side of eternity in person, I'm sure.
One way or another. One way or another, brother. I agree.
Amen.
Okay, now I told you at the beginning of the show I have the most Islamophobic intro.
Yeah.
But that is only second to the most Islamophobic exit video. So my brother Radical Moderates in the chats, and they're Cole, do the ending. Okay, so here it is. All right. God bless everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And we'll see you on Sunday on the Cross and the Crescent discussion group. Amen. He's risen indeed.
Advanced student and specialist, that the standard narrative has holes. That's what
I'm... That's all, folks.